You do not belong here. Men like you never do." Those were the words Officer Brandon Cole would hear for the rest of his life. Not once. Not as some passing embarrassment. Not as a mistake he could bury beneath paperwork, excuses, or time. He would hear them in quiet rooms. He would hear them when sleep refused to come. He would hear them in the split second before dawn, when a man is too tired to lie to himself and too awake to run from what he knows. Because some words do not fade after they are spoken. Some words come back sharpened. They return with the full weight of the moment that gave birth to them. And when they do not sound like a voice from the past. They sound like judgment. Brandon did not know that yet. On that cold October morning, standing at the stone entrance of the federal courthouse, he felt certain of himself in the way only an untested man can feel certain. Certain he was in control. Certain he understood the kind of people who belonged in a place like this, and the kind who did not. Certain the man climbing those steps in a worn jacket with an old leather briefcase was exactly who Brandon had already decided he was. He was wrong. Wrong about the man. Wrong about the moment. Wrong about himself. And within the hour, in front of a room full of people, he would learn just how wrong a man can be when he trusts his assumptions more than the truth standing right in front of him. The city woke that morning under a thin gray sky, the kind of sky that did not threaten rain, but still managed to drain the warmth out of every surface it touched. October had settled in fully now, not with drama, not with storm, just with that dry, indifferent chill that seeps into stone steps, metal railings, courthouse windows, and human bones. The federal courthouse stood at the corner of Madison and Fifth, broad and severe, its pale stone front holding the cold like it had been built for it. It had stood there for over 80 years. 80 years of verdicts, pleas, appeals, sentencing hearings, civil disputes, whispered prayers from families in the back row, and silent collapses in hallways after life-altering decisions had been handed down in rooms where the air always seemed too thin. The building had seen everything. Men in expensive suits walked in there terrified. Women in worn shoes walked out of there broken. Some came in hoping for mercy. Some came in demanding justice. Many discovered by the end of the day that the law and justice do not always arrive holding hands. If buildings could remember, this one remembered more than most, and on this particular Tuesday morning, it was about to witness something it had never witnessed before. His name was Judge Marcus Elijah Bennett. He was 58 years old, though there was something in the stillness of his face that made age feel like the least important fact about him. He was not a large man in the exaggerated sense, but he carried himself with the kind of quiet physical weight that made people move without being asked. He had the build of a man shaped less by exercise than by endurance. Broad shoulders, strong hands, a face marked not by softness, but by years of restraint. He had grown up 40 minutes south of the city, in a neighborhood that many of the men who spent their careers discussing crime, form, education, and opportunity had never once walked through themselves. He had watched his mother leave before dawn and to work one job and come home after dark from another. He had watched his father study law books at a kitchen table under a weak yellow bulb, while exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He had learned very young that some people would speak about fairness as if it were an established fact, while others lived close enough to see how fragile it really was. Marcus Bennett had spent 31 years in the law, 24 of those years on the federal bench. He had presided over cases that drew cameras from across the country. He had written opinions studied in law schools. He had faced down powerful men who were accustomed to buying distance between themselves and consequences. He had defended the rights of people no one else in the room had cared enough to defend. Day after day, case after case, year after year, he had done the long, wearying, unglamorous work of trying to keep the law from becoming merely a language spoken by the powerful to protect themselves. He did not romanticize his work. He respected it too much for that. Every morning he arrived the same way. He parked a few blocks away if he had to. He carried the same dark leather briefcase, worn at the edges, polished by years of use rather than style. He walked up the same courthouse steps with the same measured pace. Not slow, not hurried. The pace of a man who does not need the world to make way for him in order to know who he is. That morning, he wore a dark charcoal shirt beneath his coat, pressed well to be clean, though not so sharply that anyone would mistake him for a man who built his authority out of fabric. His clerk had once teased him that his collars always looked 1 minute away from a wrinkle. He had smiled and told her he had no interest in dressing like a man who needed clothing to announce what his life had already proven. Nothing about him advertised power to people who only knew how to recognize it in certain forms. That, in many ways, had been the story of his entire life. Officer Brandon Cole had been posted at the front entrance since 6:45 that morning. He was 31 years old, 7 years on the force. Good evaluations, clean record, dependable attendance, quick response times. Solid with paperwork, solid with chain of command. The kind of officer supervisors liked because he made their mornings simpler. The kind of officer who described himself as disciplined, alert, and professional. The kind who genuinely believed those words. He was not the sort of man newspapers typically expose with dramatic headlines. He had never stolen evidence, never accepted a bribe, never been caught planting anything, falsifying a major report, or taking money from anyone. If someone had asked his peers what kind of officer Brandon Cole was, most would have said some version of the same thing. Reliable, tough, a little rigid maybe, but solid. And yet there are forms of corruption that do not begin in envelopes of cash or criminal conspiracies. They begin in judgment, in habits of suspicion. In the split second before a question is asked, when a person decides what another human being is worth, how dangerous they are, how truthful they sound, how much patience they deserve, that was the place where Brandon's real problem lived. Not in official misconduct, at least not at first. In the half-breath before official conduct begins. He had a system. He would never have called it prejudice. Men rarely use that word for the thing that protects their self-image. He called it instinct, experience, reading people, street awareness, pattern recognition. He believed he could look at a person, take in their clothes, posture, pace, tone, and presence, and know something useful before they even spoke. For 7 years, no one had forced him to examine how often that instinct leaned in one direction, because systems that serve those in power are rarely tested until they fail publicly. At 7:22, Brandon saw Marcus Bennett approaching from across the street. The distance between them was no more than 30 feet, and in that one short distance, Brandon's system did what it had done 1,000 times before. It scanned, sorted, concluded. Older black man, no visible ID badge, no lanyard, no suit that fit the picture in Brandon's head of federal authority. Briefcase old enough to look cheap from a distance. Walk too relaxed for someone with a scheduled appearance, no urgency. No signal Brandon had been trained by habit to associate with belonging. Conclusion reached. By the time Marcus reached the first step, Brandon had already decided. Hey, his voice cut across the cold air, flat and firm. Stop, right there. Marcus stopped. He had been stopped before. Not on these courthouse steps. Not by this officer. But enough times, in enough places, over enough decades to recognize the tone immediately. There is a particular kind of some men use when they are not preserving order, but asserting ownership over a moment that has not yet justified their authority. Marcus knew that tone the way a man knows the taste of bitter medicine he has been forced to swallow too many times. He turned fully toward Brandon and met his eyes. Good morning, officer. Brandon took 2 steps closer. Where are you headed? Inside, Marcus said calmly. I work here. The words simplified the moment. They did not. Something changed at the corners of Brandon's eyes. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for anyone who understood what it looks like when a man hears information that conflicts with what he has already decided and rejects it, before allowing it to settle. Work here, Brandon repeated. He made the phrase sound doubtful without raising his voice. Yeah, he said with a short breath of disbelief. Doing what exactly? Marcus held his gaze. For 1 second. Then 2, it was the pause of a man deciding how much dignity to spend on a stranger who has already chosen disrespect. I'm a judge, he said. The words entered the morning air and seemed for a moment to hover there. Brandon blinked. It was small. A flicker. A crack in certainty. An involuntary sign that even his own instincts had not prepared him for the sentence he had just heard. A black man on the courthouse steps, slight wrinkle in the collar, weathered briefcase, no visible show of rank, calm voice, saying, I'm a judge. For a second and a half reality, knocked against the wall Brandon had built in his mind, then the wall held. Because some men are more committed to preserving an assumption than revising themselves in the face of evidence. Right, Brandon said, and now his voice had changed. It had taken on that hard, mocking edge people use when they believe they are being lied to by someone they have already placed beneath them. I'm going to need to see some identification. Of course, Marcus said. He shifted the briefcase slightly and moved his hand toward the clasp. Slowly, clearly. The practiced slowness of a man who has lived long enough to know that some officers interpret ordinary motion as threat only after deciding the person making it is dangerous. Marcus had spent a lifetime learning what kinds of caution certain men require from you when they hold power. But Brandon was no longer processing what Marcus was doing. He was responding to what he believed the moment meant. And when Marcus' hand moved toward the briefcase, Brandon lunged forward and grabbed his arm. The grip was sudden, hard, unnecessary. Marcus turned sharply at the contact. "Officer, I'm reaching for the identification you just asked for. I said don't move." His fingers dug deeper into Marcus's forearm. There are moments when a situation can still be called back. Moments when one man can hear himself, see what he is doing, and step back before damage becomes irreversible. This was one of those moments. Brandon did not step back. "Officer," Marcus said, keeping his voice even, "you asked for identification. That is what I'm doing. I said don't move." And then it happened. Fast enough to shock. Slow enough to be remembered forever. Brandon's hand came across Marcus's face, with a sharp open strike that cracked through the cold air and bounced against stone. The briefcase slipped from Marcus's hand. It hit the courthouse steps hard. The clasp sprang open. Papers spilled into the wind, case files, legal briefs, a yellow legal pad with handwritten notes, a scheduling memo from a clerk, routine documents from a routine working day, the ordinary contents of a life in service, scattered across the steps as though they belonged to no one. For a single suspended moment, the whole morning seemed to stop around that sound. Judge Marcus Elijah Bennett stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, where he had presided for 24 years, one hand still at his side, his face turned slightly from the force of the slap, his papers blowing over the stone. He did not swing back. He did not shout. He did not lunge. He did not give the moment even 1 second of footage that could be clipped, framed, slowed down, and transformed into an alternate story later. Instead, he became very still. Not the stillness of surrender, the stillness of control. There is a discipline some men learn only after life has demanded it from them 1,000 times. A discipline deeper than anger. A discipline forged from the understanding that in certain rooms, certain streets, certain encounters, the wrong kind of reaction will not merely fail to protect you. It will be used to justify what was done to you in the first place. Marcus Bennett had spent 58 years learning that lesson. He knew what battle he was in. He knew what kind of witness the moment required. And he knew exactly how costly it would be to hand this man anything he could later weaponize. Brandon moved behind him. "You people always make this harder than it has to be." The words came out almost casually now, as if the sentence had been waiting behind Brandon's teeth for years, just looking for the right target and the right excuse to emerge. He twisted Marcus's arms back. Metal cuffs clicked closed around his wrists. And there, on the steps of the courthouse where he had given 24 years of judicial service, Judge Marcus Bennett was placed in handcuffs. A few feet away, 2 officers turned at the commotion. One stared for a fraction too long before looking away. Another glanced down at the scattered papers and did nothing. There is a way institutions train people not merely to follow orders but to avoid truth when truth becomes inconvenient in real time. That training was present on those steps too. Inside, the machinery started moving. That is what systems do. They convert chaos into procedure. They translate harm into forms, take the account provided by authority, and begin building a structure around it before the injured person has even had time to gather their breath. Brandon gave his version first. His voice was steady again by then, almost rehearsed. The subject was behaving erratically near the main entrance, failed to comply with standard ID procedures, became verbally aggressive, reached into a bag after repeated warnings. Physical control was necessary to ensure the safety of courthouse staff. Officer Daniel Reeves, who had been nearby and seen enough to know better, confirmed it in the careful language of a man choosing self-protection over courage. Officer Kyle Mercer, who arrived after the incident, confirmed what he had not actually witnessed with the comfortable confidence of someone trusting his fellow officer more than the possibility of contradiction. The language aligned. The report smoothed out the violence. The rough edges disappeared into administrative phrasing. This is how official lies survive. Not because they are brilliant, because they are tidy. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in a preliminary hearing room, hands uncuffed now, posture straight, eyes forward. The court reporter kept glancing at him. She had spent years in rooms full of panic, outrage, grief, confusion, arrogance, and fear. She knew how people looked when they had been wrongly accused. She knew how they looked when they were guilty and trying not to appear guilty. She knew the choreography of humiliation better than she wanted to. But the composure in Marcus unsettled her more than any outburst would have. He did not fidget. He did not interrupt. He did not even seem shocked in the ordinary sense. He listened. He listened to Brandon reshape the morning. He listened to the officers support the account. He listened to the event he had just lived through being rewritten in real time into something almost unrecognizable. Every word entered the room polished. Procedure has a way of making even ugliness sound efficient. Marcus did not object, not because he accepted it, because he understood the room better than anyone in it. He had spent 24 years on the bench, long enough to know how often rage, even justified rage, is turned against the person who carries it. Long enough to know that a black man raising his voice in a room where official narratives are already forming is often treated not as a wounded citizen, but as confirmation of the danger others have alleged. He had seen it too many times to waste this moment on the wrong response. When the presiding officer finally turned to him and asked whether he had anything to say on his own behalf, several people in the room shifted slightly. The expectation was almost visible. They were waiting for indignation, for some version of protest, for anger, perhaps eloquent anger, perhaps bitter anger, but anger nonetheless. What they got instead was a single sentence. "Play the security footage." The room changed. No one gasped. No chair scraped dramatically across the floor. No one whispered, and yet everything changed. It changed in the way air changes when a storm breaks somewhere nearby and everyone feels the pressure shift before the thunder arrives. Brandon felt it first in his chest, a tightening he did not like, and immediately tried to dismiss. He told himself there would be no problem, told himself the footage would support what he said, told himself this was routine. But certainty had begun slipping from him, and somewhere beneath his confidence, a thin, cold thread of fear had already started to pull. The recess lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes can be very short when a man is winning. 17 minutes can feel like a narrow hallway with no exit when the truth may be walking toward you. Brandon sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight, knee-locked, eyes fixed on a point that kept losing meaning. He replayed the morning in fragments, the stop, the words, the grab, the strike, the cuffs. Each replay came with a new urge to reinterpret himself, to explain, to soften, to rename. But no private language is strong enough to save a man once evidence has become undeniable. Across the room, Marcus sat with his hands folded in front of him, as calm as if he were waiting for arguments to begin in a routine matter on an ordinary docket, because in a sense, he was. He had already passed through humiliation and reached clarity. When the doors opened again, the atmosphere that came back in with the staff was no longer the same atmosphere that had left. The bailiff stood differently. The clerks near the back were too still. The court reporter's hands rested in her lap instead of over the machine. Every person who had seen the footage now carried the same burden. They knew what had happened. And worse, they knew how readily they had accepted the wrong version of it. All rise. The bailiff's voice was careful, almost reverent. The Honorable Judge, Marcus Elijah Bennett, presiding. For 1 second, Brandon did not stand. It was not defiance. His body simply failed to obey the world quickly enough. He looked toward the side door as though hoping some alternate explanation might still appear. Some procedural misunderstanding. Some substitute judge. Some absurd technicality that would explain why the man he had slapped on the courthouse steps was now entering in a black robe with the settled authority of someone returning not to a role he had borrowed, but to a place that had belonged to him for decades. Marcus walked to the bench. No flourish, no visible anger, no theatrical satisfaction, only familiarity. He took his seat the way a man sits in his own chair after a long day, not because he is performing ownership, but because he has no need to. Silence fell across the room with almost physical force. Brandon stood now, but he felt strangely detached from his own body, as though his spine and hands and jaw belonged to someone else. His thoughts were trying desperately to assemble themselves into a structure that would preserve him, but every possible version collapsed the moment it rose. Marcus looked out at the room. He did not rush. That mattered. Men who understand power often mistake speed for strength, but some moments demand to be lived at their full weight. Some truths must be allowed to settle into the room slowly, enough that no one can later pretend they were merely passing events. Marcus let the silence do what silence does when it has finally been paired with truth. Then he spoke. "I want to say something before we proceed." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who had addressed courtrooms for 24 years and never once needed volume to command attention. I want to say it not as the judge presiding over this room, not even as the man who was standing on those steps this morning. He paused, but as someone who has sat in this seat long enough to know exactly what happens when systems fail the law, even has a chance to speak. No one moved. I have spent most of my adult life trying to protect the principle that every person who enters this building deserves the same measure of dignity, the same protection under the law, and the same opportunity to be seen as a human being before being processed as a threat. One hand lightly on the bench. This morning I was reminded of something many Americans already know intimately, that the most damaging injustice often does not begin in the courtroom. It begins in the moment before, in the glance before the question, in the conclusion reached before a fact is known, in the assumption that some people must prove they belong before they have even spoken. The air in the room felt thinner now. Marcus turned his gaze toward the monitor. Let's look at what actually happened. The footage began. The courthouse entrance came alive on screen in black and white clarity. There was Marcus approaching the steps. There was Brandon at his post. There was the stop, the exchange, the posture, the reach toward the briefcase, the grab, the strike, the spill of papers, the cuffs, and then the audio, clear, undeniable, cold in its plainness. You do not belong here. Men like you never do. No one in the room would later remember breathing at that exact moment, because those words, played back in that setting, did something more devastating than outrage alone could do. They removed ambiguity, not the polished report, not the institutional language, not the softened version constructed after the fact. The thing itself, ugly, direct, unmistakable. Marcus stopped the footage. He looked at Brandon, and what Brandon saw in that gaze did more damage than anger could have done. There was no triumph in it. There was disappointment, wariness, and something heavier still. A kind of sorrow known only to people who have lived long enough to stop being surprised by cruelty, but never become numb to it. You told me this morning that men like me do not belong here, Marcus said. His voice was not sharp. It carried none of the satisfying edge the room might have expected. That made it harder to hear. I want you to understand something, Officer Cole, not as a personal rebuke, as a truth. He leaned forward slightly. There are no men like me. Then after a beat, there are only people. The words hung in the room, each one carrying a life you cannot outmeasure from 30 feet away, each one arriving with burdens, obligations, dignity, history, and rights that do not diminish because you fail to recognize them. Brandon stared at the floor. Marcus continued, You did not question me this morning. You concluded me. And once you reached that conclusion, you used every tool available to you to force reality to fit it. He let the sentence settle. That is not vigilance. That is not professionalism. And it is not what this badge is for. No one in the room needed the point explained further, but Marcus was not speaking only to the room. He was speaking into the record of the institution itself. This building exists to remind power that it has limits. To remind the government that authority is not the same as righteousness. To remind every person entrusted with responsibility that force without discipline becomes abuse. Very quickly, he looked once more at Brandon. The law cannot mean anything if those empowered to enforce order have already decided who belongs inside its protection and who does not. The proceedings ended that morning in silence, deeper than the one that had preceded them. Not because everyone had suddenly become noble, not because one speech had healed anything, but because truth has a way of stripping a room down to its bare moral structure. And once that happens, everyone inside has to reckon with where they were standing. The investigation began immediately. At first, it concerned the incident on the courthouse steps. By the end of the week, it was something larger, because once someone finally has the courage or the evidence to look closely, patterns begin to emerge. Complaints that had once been dismissed as misunderstandings were reopened. Incident reports from the last 7 years were reviewed. Traffic stops, building entries, detention logs, use of force memos, internal notes, civilian statements that had been filed and quietly buried beneath phrasing like insufficient corroboration or officer discretion. Taken one by one, each case had seemed manageable. Taken together, they told a story. Not of one bad day, not of one regrettable misjudgment of a habit, a method, a consistent leaning of suspicion in one direction and patience in another. 1,000 choices made before evidence, 1,000 assumptions protected by uniform procedure, and the cultural habit of believing an officer's language before a citizen's pain. Brandon Cole lost everything that could be stripped by policy. His badge, his firearm authorization, his pension, his standing, his reputation in the department. His claim to the 7 years he had once believed proved his character. The official explanation named misconduct, falsification, excessive force, discriminatory behavior, and repeated abuse of discretion. But official language, even when accurate, rarely captures the true shape of a fall. What Brandon lost first was not the job. It was the story he had told himself about who he was. That collapse takes longer and hurts more. In the weeks that followed, the city talked. Talked on courthouse steps. Talked in diners. Talked in barbershops, council offices, law firms, church basements, and police union hallways. Talked on evening broadcasts and early morning radio. Some spoke with outrage, some with defensiveness, some with the exhausted tone of people who were tired of being asked whether what they had always known was finally real now that there was footage. Because for many, nothing that happened that Tuesday was surprising, only documented. Judge Marcus Bennett returned to work the very next morning. He parked 3 blocks away because the maintenance crew had blocked the reserved spaces. He carried the same briefcase. He climbed the same courthouse steps. The young officer on duty that day was Officer Hannah Pierce, 4 months into the job, still young enough to feel the difference between duty and morality as a fresh wound instead of a dulled compromise. She straightened immediately when she saw him coming. Not out of fear, out of respect, and something more fragile than respect. Shame by association, Marcus noticed it. He gave her a small nod as he passed. Not warm enough to suggest the thing was forgotten. Not cold enough to make her carry another man's guilt as if it were her own. He took the elevator up, entered chambers, placed the briefcase on the desk, removed his coat, put on the robe, reviewed the docket, and began. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him. Not that he had been wronged. Many people are wronged. Not that he had the authority to expose it. Many do not. It was the way he returned. There are things a title cannot give a man. A title can grant jurisdiction. It can authorize a signature. It can place people on their feet when you enter a room. But it cannot create dignity where none exists. It cannot create discipline. It cannot manufacture the kind of moral steadiness required to absorb humiliation without becoming consumed by the temptation to humiliate in return. Marcus Bennett possessed that steadiness long before anyone called him Your Honor. He had learned it as a boy watching his mother come home, too tired to complain and still rise the next day. He had learned it as a young black student in rooms where his intelligence was treated as surprising. He had learned it in law school corridors where certain silences carried more contempt than open insults. He had learned it as a young attorney, standing before judges who listened to white lawyers with neutrality and black lawyers with scrutiny. He had learned it case by case, season by season, through a lifetime of understanding that dignity is not bestowed by institutions. It is tested by them. And because he knew that, he also knew something many powerful men never learn. The most powerful response is rarely the most explosive one. It is the one that serves more people than your own wounded pride. Marcus could have made that Tuesday about his own humiliation alone. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he made it about a principle, about the terrible damage done in the fraction of a second before official conduct begins, about the hidden place where prejudice slips into policy through habit, about the difference between asking a question and enforcing a conclusion. Within the courthouse, changes began. Not dramatic ones at first. Institutional change never looks cinematic in real life. It looked like retraining, rewritten protocols, expanded review procedures, mandatory documentation, scenario-based bias assessment, outside oversight, body camera policy revisions, entry procedure reform. A new line in the handbook, simple enough for a child to understand, difficult enough for adults to obey. Ask first, conclude later, every time. It looked like supervisors asking harder questions when reports came in too tidy. It looked like younger officers being told that confidence is not the same as accuracy. It looked like senior staff learning, reluctantly, that order without humility turns cruel faster than anyone likes to admit. Did everything change? No. No city transforms itself because one man was exposed. No institution becomes pure because one judge spoke truth in a courtroom. Human beings do not surrender comforting patterns that easily. But something real changed. Something measurable. Something lived not in speeches, but in daily conduct. And that matters. Because culture is not shaped only by dramatic moments. It is shaped by repetition, by what gets corrected, by what gets ignored, by what new people are taught to normalize. For months after, people kept replaying the same question. How could Brandon not know? But that was, in a way, the wrong question. The more useful question was this. What kind of thinking allows a man to decide another person does not belong before he has heard a single sentence long enough to reveal the truth? Because that question reaches beyond one officer, beyond one courthouse, beyond one morning. It reaches into schools, offices, churches, boardrooms, airports, neighborhoods, hospitals, universities, and every place where appearance gets quietly translated into worth before evidence is allowed into the room. Marcus understood that. That is why, when reporters later tried to summarize the story as one officer's downfall, he corrected them gently. This was not only about one man, he said in a brief statement several days later. It was about what becomes possible when unchecked assumptions are mistaken for judgment. No outrage in the wording, no performance, no righteous grandstanding, just clarity. Brandon, meanwhile, entered the long private territory where public disgrace gives way to personal reckoning. That territory is lonelier than punishment. There are no headlines there, no court transcripts, no badge to hide behind, no fellow officers to steady you with shared language. Only memory. Memory of the moment, memory of the slap, memory of the sound of his own voice saying words he could no longer defend, memory of watching the man he had handcuffed take the bench with calm he himself did not possess. In later years, Brandon would likely be tempted to tell himself that he had been tired, that it was a stressful morning, that everyone makes mistakes, that he had not meant it the way it sounded, that the pressure of the job had shaped him, that public anger had exceeded the offense, that the system had made him. All of those things might contain fragments of truth. None of them would excuse what happened. Because what happened on those courthouse steps was not born in fatigue, it was revealed by it. Fatigue does not create character, it exposes the one you have built. And what Brandon's fatigue revealed that morning was a reflex so deeply rehearsed he mistook it for instinct. Months later, new recruits would be shown that footage in training. Not publicly, not for spectacle, for instruction. They would watch the approach, the stop, the body language, the escalation, the strike, the handcuffs. Then they would watch what followed, the report, the confidence, the courtroom, the correction, the truth. And instructors would pause the video at the critical point, not at the slap, but earlier. At the moment of first contact, at the glance, at the instant, Brandon decided who Marcus was, because that was where the whole collapse truly began. Not with violence, with assumption. By the time violence appeared, the moral failure had already taken place. Marx never asked to become a symbol of anything, but life often appoints people to symbolic moments whether they seek them or not. In private, those close to him said the incident weighed on him more than he let the public see. Of course it did. Dignity is not the absence of pain. Composure is not proof that something did not wound you. He was not made of marble, he was a man. A man who had given decades of his life to an institution, only to be told at its entrance that he did not belong. That kind of insult does not leave because you answered it well. It leaves its mark. But Marcus carried the mark the same way he had carried so many others. Not by denying it, by refusing to let it deform what he believed duty required of him. And perhaps that, more than any speech, is what made his response unforgettable. He did not merely expose injustice. He outlived the moment without surrendering his own humanity to it. The courthouse at Madison and Fifth still stands. Cold in autumn, heavy in winter, bright and severe in spring light. Its stone has absorbed another story now. People still pass those steps every day. Attorneys with coffee in hand, clerks late to chambers, defendants trying to breathe through fear, families clutching hope like paperwork, officers scanning faces, judges arriving with histories no one can see from a distance. Most mornings are ordinary. That is how institutions survive. On routine, on repetition, on the appearance that the machinery is functioning as it should. But every now and then, one morning exposes the truth about all the others. That Tuesday did. It revealed how thin the line can be between order and abuse when authority is not disciplined by humility. It revealed how quickly a human being can be misread when another person mistakes familiarity with certainty. It revealed that titles, accomplishments, years of service, and legal brilliance do not protect a man from the danger of being reduced in the eyes of someone who has chosen not to see him. And it revealed something else too. That truth, when finally given room to stand, still has power. Power to strip away false narratives. Power to shame institutions into movement. Power to instruct the next generation more effectively than policy memos ever will. Power to remind every person carrying authority that their first obligation is not control. It is discernment, it is restraint. It is the discipline to ask before concluding. The man Brandon, dismissed as not belonging, turned out to be the man whose name could end his career. Yes, but the deeper lesson was never merely about status. Because even if Marcus Bennett had not been a judge, he still would have deserved not to be struck, not to be demeaned, not to be caged inside someone else's prejudice before a single fact had been established. That is the center of the story. Not the twist, not the irony, not even the downfall. The center is humanity. A man walking to work on a cold October morning. A briefcase worn by use. A life too large to be read from 30 feet away. A system that failed him before it knew him. And the truth that forced that failure into the light. That is what the courthouse learned. That is what Officer Brandon Cole would spend years understanding. And that is what Judge Marcus Elijah Bennett had known long before he ever wore a robe. You do not begin with conclusions. Not if you are worthy of power. Not if you understand justice. Not if you remember that every person crossing your path carries a life. You have not earned the right to summarize with a glance. Ask first. Conclude later. Always. Because the person standing before you may hold authority you cannot imagine. May carry pain you cannot see. May be more honorable than you. May be the one who by the end of the day reveals exactly who you are. Or they may simply be a human being. And that alone should have been enough.